Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship by Venture for Canada. Venture for Canada is a national charity on a mission to foster the entrepreneurial skills and mindsets of young Canadians. Our vision is a Canada where young people can equitably realize their entrepreneurial potential to help build one of the most prosperous entrepreneurial ecosystems in the world.
Meet Stewart Beck, a distinguished diplomat with a rich history of fostering international relations and promoting Canadian interests abroad. With a career spanning pivotal roles in places like Taiwan, Silicon Valley, and as president of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, Stewart brings a wealth of experience in understanding global dynamics and their impact on entrepreneurship. In this conversation, we explore Stewart's insights on how Canada can cultivate a culture of entrepreneurship, drawing from global best practices and his unique experiences. Beck discusses the need for embracing risk, the importance of failure in entrepreneurial journeys, and the impact of immigration on Canada's entrepreneurial landscape. This episode offers valuable perspectives for anyone interested in the intersection of diplomacy, global economics, and entrepreneurship. Stewart and I have known each other for 8 or 9 years or so at this point, and I don't think I've interviewed someone yet on the podcast who I've known so well. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Stewart and I have been friends for many years. He was on the board of Venture for Canada for several years, and we've gotten to know each other through a variety of different things. Stewart, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Scott. It's great to see you too. So it's always fun to be talking with you. I always learn a lot myself, by the way. So
Likewise, I always enjoy our chats as well, including our pre-chat. We talked about a really wide range of topics, and I always enjoy our conversations. So to get things kicked off, Stewart, can you describe what exactly is a culture of entrepreneurship?
well, Scott, you and I have talked about risk before, and I think in a culture of entrepreneurship, it's really how people approach risk and what it means to them and what it means to building, certainly in a capitalist society, what it is to come up with an idea and then have the risk profile to be able to go out and make something happen. And it doesn't necessarily have to be just in the context of starting businesses. And again, we've talked about this before. It's the attitude you have towards risk in a big organization. So if you're working in a big organization, like I was working in Global Affairs Canada at that time, I was Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. People see bureaucrats as being risk adverse. But in my mind, if you want to make things happen, and if you're really trying to build, good policy platforms, you're trying to create economic development and growth, you do have to take certain risks and come up with different ways of doing things, particularly in this day and age where things are moving so quickly. And if you don't have that right kind of attitude towards risk, and if you don't come up with ways to kind of manage risk, it becomes very difficult to bring about change, particularly change that you need. So change can happen economically, and change can happen within the bureaucracy. And it's about risk and how you manage that risk. And for young Canadians who want to become entrepreneurs, that's something they have to ask themselves. Am I willing to take the risk? Am I willing to figure out ways to mitigate that risk? It's a lot of it really relates to the risk profile that the individual wants to take.
What are some of the things that influence someone's risk profile?
Well, I know we're going to talk probably a little bit about the Valley down the road, but I think this is a good example. So I opened Canada's trade office in Silicon Valley in the mid '80s, and the companies I was dealing with at that time were predominantly, I'd say almost completely male dominated. Okay, white male kind of Canadians from very much like me. Okay, in many ways, and their attitude towards risk was quite different. And talking to them when they came into the Valley, they typically had good technologies, but how they wanted to go about selling it was not really in the same mindset as the Americans that were there and working with them. And so I found it quite frustrating working with the Canadian companies trying to sell into that market. And then roll forward to 2009 when I went back to San Francisco and I was a consul general, and we were doing a program with young startups coming into the Valley and introducing them to potential funders and potential market opportunities. And man, it was quite a bit different. The attitude towards risk was quite a bit different. And most of the people that were running companies, those young Canadian companies, were from diasporas, either Chinese diasporas, Indian diasporas, Persian diasporas. It was really quite interesting. And it made me realize that their attitude towards risk was quite a bit different than the old, what I would call Canadian approach to risk, which was really driven a lot by the banking community in Canada, which was very risk adverse. It was all asset based lending. And so you have to put up an awful lot of stuff, collateral, to make sure things are going. So, when you're an immigrant coming into a new country like Canada, it's a big risk in the first place to come. And so their attitude towards risk is quite a bit different than the attitude that we were trained with when I was trained with growing up. And so that to me was a big difference in sort of understanding what risk meant and what it meant to different types of people.
On this point that you were just talking about, I was speaking with a Canadian entrepreneur who is an immigrant and has founded a over $1 billion company this morning, an immigrant to Canada. And one of the things he talked about that he saw as one of the main issues in Canada is that people are uncomfortably comfortable, which I love that term. I had never heard of it before. But he just talks about how in the country that he grew up in, which was a very unstable, developing country, he was like every second year there was like economic collapse. And then in Canada, now the interest rates are a little bit higher. It's a little bit more economically tumultuous as we tape this in mid or in late 2023. He was like, that's nothing compared to where he grew up in. It was like so many people were facing like complete destitution. It's to say some people are still facing destitution in Canada, but maybe not at the same relative kind of like scale. How do you think that Canada can kind of overcome that sense that, or yeah, how do you think that Canada can overcome that uncomfortably comfortable phenomenon?
Uncomfortably comfortable phenomenon. Well, in some ways, I wish we weren't right next door to the United States, because that makes us uncomfortably comfortable, because we can do business very easily there. And again, it's less risky. No, it doesn't cost as much money. It's a similar type of legal system. You're you're dealing with something that's very familiar, and again, we tend to ride on the back of that type of comfort level. And so, I've spent 7 years running the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, and one of the things that we were trying to do is get people to understand where the growth opportunities will be, and that's in Asia. And to be able to succeed in Asia, you have to be uncomfortably uncomfortable, okay, which is the reality, because it's a different mindset, different cultures, different ways of doing business, different legal systems, and all these things. It's just much easier to say, forget it, we'll just do business in the United States. Okay. That's a challenge. And so, as long as we have that as an outlet, it's going to be very, very hard to change, quite frankly. And, when we have really smart people I've been very lucky to work with very, very smart, very aggressive people. I spent a lot of my career in Asia, so those people coming out to markets like India and Shanghai at the time were intrepid. So there are those people that are out there, but I'll tell you, the default is to take the path of least resistance, and that's the challenge. And you have to kind of make this decision yourself: is it easier to do business in the United States and not spend an awful lot of money and know I can be successful, or is it saying the growth is global, and how do I approach global markets, and do I have the strategy, and do I have the risk tolerance, and these are the types of things that businesses will have to face. And if we don't do that, then we're going to be forever wed to the North American marketplace, quite frankly. And that's, I mean, people will say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, okay, this limits your growth. Okay, so we are what? 90% of our economy is based on small, medium-sized enterprise. So we'll be forever. We will not have companies that will grow to a scale that will be globally competitive. We'll be successful, but not necessarily as successful as we can be. So, long-winded answer, Scott. I'm sorry.
It's such an interesting topic, and I do, as a somewhat of a side, I'm thinking of Peter Zeihan, who's like a geopolitical analyst, in a book that he wrote, uh, and it's not called like End Times or something. But it's basically one of the points he makes is he's American and he's very bullish on America. uh, but one of the things he talks about is the power of the sort of a North American economic union, kind of in the future, which already kind of exists a little bit through NAFTA, U.S. and Mexico, Canada free trade agreement. But he talks about how like the combined North American market is something that in a world that is potentially a lot more tumultuous, there's a lot going for North America in the sense that it's a huge economic region. There's a lot of natural resources in North America. There's differentiated players. So like Mexico has like a different economic role than the United States. So all this to say is that I agree, Stuart. I think that thinking global is important for Canada, but I wonder that in an era of potentially greater global instability, does it potentially make sense for Canada to kind of lean in to North America as an area of focus? And this question is more at the macro scale. It goes beyond individual companies. It's more about kind of our national strategy.
I think we've already leaned into North America, as you said, with the agreements that we've had and the relationships that we have. And again, relationships tend to be more north-south in the North American context than across the country. But still, I take a look at where I am in Vancouver, and the Cascadia corridor, closely knits BC to Washington and Oregon, and to a certain degree California. Um, but the question becomes independence of thinking and independence of, when I say thinking, I'm talking now at the policy level, not independent thinkers like individually, but and this is becoming more relevant in the context of reshoring or friendshoring, if you want to call it that. When you take a look at the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of the shots, if we rely completely and solely on the North American market, if we have this union, means our ability to make some decisions ourselves in Canada become much more constrained, okay, because we're going to be so dependent on US policy and the way the US, everything that they do, we're going to have to react to. It's not like we can kind of decide what's in our best interest. And so, as a proud Canadian, I'm married to an American. I've spent much of my time in the United States in terms of my career and my family and such like that. And as much as I love Americans, I also very proud Canadian that I want our own decisions to be made based on what's best for us as a country. And I think that's what I would worry about if we rely strictly on a North American community for us to be able to do business. We need to be able to diversify, and we need to think strategically in how we can increase that ability to diversify in a very uncertain period of time where we are right now. And so if we don't, then we're going to be 100% reliant, as opposed to where we are right now, which is not 100% reliant. I don't know what we are in terms of percentage, but we're not 100% reliant.
Yeah, I think to your point, it's important that Canada maintain optionality. Like going into all in on the US is something that I think poses more long-term risks. And I think in some ways that's one of the great tensions, it seems like, of Canadian foreign policy is it's not abandoning our relationships with the US or neglecting it, but it's at the same time how to balance the relationships with the US and Mexico with our more global aspirations, and how do we kind of balance those different kind of interests? Because to your point, Stuart, I agree. I think going global is important, but what's also important, and I imagine you would agree with this as well, is maintaining like the close ties we have with the U.S. And do you think that is one of the kind of existential challenges of Canadian
No,
diplomacy?
I'd like to think, for most of my career in the foreign service and in diplomacy, I'd like to have considered ourselves, Canada, as an upper middle power. Okay, in the sense that we're a G7 country. Um, we had that relationship we have had and have that relationship with the United States, which is always a very strong fundamental basis to what we are. But we could be seen as having an independent foreign policy in many areas, not all areas, but in many areas. And that's why we were so strong in the governance context and multilateral institutions. Canada was seen as a major player. I'm not 100% sure we're still seen in that light as a major player in the context of international institutions. But certainly, for most of my career, Canada was the honest broker and that middle power that had influence in the conversation of setting governance standards and how we would be looked at. When we had large telecommunication companies, when we had the Nortels and New Bridges of the world and BlackBerry, Canada played an outsized role at the ITU, International Telecommunications Union, because they saw Canada as being a real player in that sense, and we were setting global standards that were beneficial to us, of course, but beneficial in general because they felt that we weren't really kind of building everything in the context of what the United States wanted, and we had our own kind of independence in that context. So I just hope I would like to see us in that role going forward and maintaining that role as a upper middle power. And I don't want to see us be stepping backwards into a middle power that's closely in line with the United States, right? We have to have that independence of thought and the ability to kind of set the standards in governance issues in a way that makes the most sense from a much larger than just U.S. perspective, right? So.
Yeah, we don't want to be what's the term in a tributary
Yeah, a
power,
tributary,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
In the context of like Chinese history, which is
Yeah.
more of a term kind of used there than often the West. But I do think that it's a cautionary tale for Canadian diplomacy. Shifting gears a little bit to the culture of entrepreneurship question. You've lived in Silicon Valley, but you've also lived in Taiwan. And you
Mhm.
spent almost 5 years in Taiwan during a period of immense economic growth and transformation.
Mhm.
I think in many ways you lived in Taiwan in probably some of the most fascinating kind of period of time to live in the place. So my question to you, Stewart, is what lessons did you glean from your experience living in Taiwan as it relates to how to foster a culture of entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a couple of things that I came away with. One is really observational. I got a really good understanding of what globalization meant because I was in Taiwan at the time that they were, it's globalization and the value of an industrial policy. Okay, so Taiwan, really from post Second World War time right up until the 90s was they were doing a lot of things in what I would call traditional sectors, toys, footwear, bicycles. They were kind of they owned that type of market over time. They started off not as a high quality producer, but over time became a very high quality producer of those types of products. And in Taiwan in the 90s when I was there and watching them move into the semiconductor space, and they still were, TSMC and UMC were just beginning to get their mojo going in the context of becoming a silicon foundry type of arrangement. And so what I saw was this movement of traditional industries, and China was opening up in the 90s, as certainly on the coastal regions, and a lot of Taiwanese investment was going into the mainland, moving that footwear in particular was a big business that was in Taiwan, and watching that move into the mainland, bicycles, a whole bunch of other things as well. Most of it manufacturing related, and then moving into the technology space. And it was an organization which I came to know and understand quite well, and it was really a function of Taiwanese industrial policy. It was called ITRI, which was the Information Technology Research Institute, if I remember correctly, ITRI, and they were an arm of sort of the Taiwan government's industrial policies. How we were going to go into that next generation of global excellence in technology in particular. And so you saw what was happening. They were supporting the whole silicon business, and you saw these fabs beginning to come in. But it wasn't just the silicon side of things. It was also the everything that was related to peripherals and computers. So printers, laptops. I mean, there was a whole bunch of things that they had. They were investing in these companies and helping support them as they grew into scaling to an international marketplace, which is again our biggest struggle in Canada. Is we might have great technologies, but we have a hard time scaling. So it was really a fascinating time for me to watch globalization at work. And to understand that there is a role for industrial policy, for a country the size of Taiwan. And got to remember, it's physically the size of Vancouver Island, with a population of about 25, 26 million people. So it's not huge. So there were many lessons that I took away from that period of time, and I was really trying it with others in the trade office to build those connectivities. To build a connectivity between Canada and where we could do it. I mean, again, because of the reality of our geopolitical relationship with China, but certainly on the trade side, how do we make those connections between, like, the NRC as an organization in Canada and ETRI in Taiwan, so we can actually learn and maybe put in place some of those policies that would help us grow in that context. So it was a good 4 years that I was there, and it was really quite a learning experience. There was something else. I'll talk about it that is really relevant to today. But you can ask. It looks like you want to ask another question. So
No, keep on going.
no. So having come from the Valley in the mid '80s, okay, and watching what was happening there, they were, again, in the case of economic efficiency, a lot of what they were doing in Silicon Valley was all about silicon. And what they were beginning to do, because it was getting very expensive to manufacture chips in the Valley, they were moving it offshore. So it went offshore to Japan and Korea, and then to Taiwan. And what you began to realize, and this is something I learned when I was there, one of the things that you lose when you do that is the human capacity on some of the critical things that you need. So on the design side, you always had that capacity in North America, whether it was in the U.S. and even in Canada, we have some really great design capacity, and we still do. But when it comes to manufacturing, you need certain skill sets, and those skill sets were actually migrating to Asia. And whether the skill sets were in Korea, and they certainly are now in Taiwan, and now in mainland China, it's hard to replace those. Okay, and it takes time to build that capacity, and that's when you talk about moving fab capacity off Taiwan into North America, mainly the United States. For the U.S. to be able to get that capacity back is going to take time, and it takes an awful lot of skilling to get there. So it's no surprise that TSMC has to bring a lot of people from Taiwan into Austin or wherever they're doing their plants. I can't remember exactly, to be able to have the, it's a very expensive proposition. I think the cost of a fab now is in the billions of dollars. And so, if you don't have the people, it's one thing to have the fab, but you have to have the people who run the fab. So much of this comes down to the human dimension, the talent that's required to be able to do this stuff. And that's one of the things that I saw and commented on, quite frankly, is, wow, that capacity basically has moved out of the United States, and it's now resident in Asia. And it's not just in Taiwan, it's in Korea, Taiwan, not so much Japan because it's too expensive to do it in Japan, but certainly in the mainland. Has now moved into the mainland, and that's something that is going to take a while to replace here in North America.
For context on our listeners, how would you define what is industrial policy?
Well, it's where the government takes a role in deciding where I don't. The term used to be picking winners and losers. Okay, it's not so much picking winners and losers in my mind. It's having a strategy to say, okay, a little bit of foresight, where are things going to be going, and then build on your strength, and then put programs around that to support it. So I personally think that the Global Innovation Cluster program that we have in Canada now is a good example of strong industrial policy, because the decision was taken by the government to support those areas in Canada. I don't mean geographic, but technology areas in Canada where we have global leadership. It just so happens now that we have them across the country. So we have ocean technologies where we do have global leadership. It's based on the East Coast. You have AI, and I think most people will recognize Canada as a machine learning global leader, and that's based in Montreal. You have next generation manufacturing. A lot of that's around the automotive sector, where we do have leadership, particularly in the tier 2 supply network. Again, that's in Ontario. And then we have protein, which is, again, we're an agricultural leader globally. I think people would recognize that. And again, the technology around ag tech and those technologies that's based out of Saskatchewan, and then digital, which is in this case more focused on healthcare, digital technology around healthcare and remote sensing. They cut across a number of different sectors, but we have that based in Vancouver. So the government said, okay, we're going to put money into this and drive, scale, ideally as a result of the type of industrial policy. So it's not the first time I think in my career that I've ever seen the government take that type of approach. And in many ways, it's very similar to what Taiwan had done in the 90s when they morphed out of what I would call traditional sectors into more globally leading technology sectors.
You consider tariffs or protectionism as an aspect of industrial policy?
Well, it depends on how you want to look at it. If you want to protect your market, yeah, tariffs are very important. I don't think, again, to be globally competitive, um, there. I mean, I have to be careful what I say because you take a look at like China, for example. They structured a lot of their economy to help build their domestic companies into global leaders, right? And so it becomes difficult. You can't compete. The telecommunications sector was one good example, and that helped them build Huawei as a company. And that, again, at the beginning, it was an open market for the technology companies the telecommunications company going into China. But then it's not a level playing field. And so they use different tariff structures and different, what I would call trade policy uh, programs and, ways of doing business that made it difficult for Canadian and other companies to compete in that market. And of course, you always have to worry about your own technology and IP. Now that the Chinese are global leaders in many sectors, the issue around IP is not what it was when I was there back in 2000, where any company coming in, you were really at risk of losing your IP. So you always have to be, I was always counseling them, just be very, very careful in terms of the relationships that you establish. So yes, you can use that to your advantage, but in a developed country, using tariffs as a way, it becomes, well, you have to be competitive and you have to be able to interact with the global community. It just doesn't work in your favor. I mean, what you want to do is your effort should be on pulling all the tariff structures down so there's a level playing field across all countries. And that's one of the challenges we've had with India, because India, it's too worried. It's still not at that stage yet where they feel comfortable that they can drop their tariff structure, particularly on goods. And for them, they have a different focus on things that they can compete in globally. So they're always looking at us to open up our markets for the movement of people, right? So it's always going to be very difficult to negotiate an agreement with them because we're at two different levels and stages in our economic development, and it really works the best when you're dealing with United States and Canada or equivalent economically. But even then, we still have our problems, whether it's in the forest product sector or in some of the agricultural sector. So you're always are going to run into issues. But it's much better if you have an open, if you don't rely on tariffs as your industrial policy strength, because it just in many ways kills competition. So
There was a recent special report in The Economist that was all about industrial policy and its failings. And it's interesting because I think that sometimes industrial policy means different things to different people.
Different people, yeah.
I think some people think of industrial policy principally through the views of tariffs. And then some people think of industrial policy more as what you described it as, like making investments in subsidies and programs that support. Although I think that there can be a fine line of like, when does a subsidy kind of become a quasi tariff is an interesting question.
Well, you have to ask us to go back to 2008 when we bailed out the automotive industry, when we spent $15 billion at the time. I forget what the United States put. I think we put in 20% of the support to GM and Chrysler, and that was it. That was industrial policy, okay, for all intents and purposes. What was bothersome to me at the time, having being in Ottawa and watching things evolve, is, I mean, the automotive industry is a fundamental industry in this country, and it's understandable why it was being supported. Okay. But if you take a look at where the future would be and what we were doing and what we were developing, there was really no support, um, what I would call for the intellectual component of our economic development. So Nortel at the time was going through all sorts of issues and problems, and but they still had leading edge global technologies. Optical was one area that they were still a global leader, and of course 5G. That whole area of what has now become certainly Huawei's. When they purchased our Nortel's 5G and technologies, that was kind of like a crown jewel. We didn't support Nortel. It was one of the companies we didn't support at that time, in the context of 2008, and for whatever reason we didn't do it. But if we had supported Nortel and stripped down Nortel, where it was only focused on its leading edge technologies, and put the money into it, Nortel probably would be, a 5G leader in the world today, or a telecoms leader in the world today. But that was a decision that was taken, because part of it was, well, we don't believe in industrial policy and that type of support. Oh yeah, but we do support the automotive industry. Okay, again, it's understandable that we support the automotive industry because it's so fundamental to our economy. But you tend not to support what I would call the intellectual dimensions of it. When I say intellectual, the technology dimensions, only because, well, those people always find another job, right? I mean, it's not a problem from that perspective. So it just means that people walk. It's hard. You can't move a automotive plant, but people who have the technology wherewithal can just go to where the opportunity would be. Most of that was in the United States at that time. So, it was one of those things that you watch happening and say, well, if we could just bring in that thinking in terms of where the next technologies will be and what the future will be, and invest in that. In this case, keep Nortel alive, or put money into the startup community to keep those companies alive during a difficult financial period. These are the types of things that that's where, in my mind, industrial policy can work. It's looking that next step ahead.
Do you think that the electric vehicle investments that Canada is making in terms of EV plants is an example of effective industrial policy?
Um, I mean, I think the jury will be out until we see what happens. If I was to look at it, I mean, battery plants, one component. Uh, we already have the assembly capacity in the country, so if we wanted to go down that way, you're supporting that. I would be looking a little further upstream, okay, which is in the critical mineral sectors which we have in the country. Because if we are able to find it, process it, you may not have to put so much money into having the battery plants and the Volkswagens and others to come, because if we have that capacity here, then they will come to it, because it's how close you are to your supply network. So, I mean, this is not necessarily being critical of the government, because I think obviously with the Inflation Reduction Act, you're going to have to compete with the United States. And if the decision is to compete with batteries, okay, that's a decision that you have to take. But again, strategically looking at further upstream, it's not just about extraction, it's actually extraction and processing. And once you have the extraction and processing, it will attract the manufacturing side. So I would have thought a little bit differently, but again, I'm not the expert in this particular space. But strategically, I would be thinking a little further upstream, because if you have control, the upstream dimensions and the downstream will come naturally, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, neither am I. I think I'm an expert in the subject. I find that it's very intriguing. Like the EV investments are definitely a very politically charged conversation, where there's very strong views both ways. And by the way, it doesn't necessarily even break on party lines. It just sometimes people just have really strong opinions on the subject. And I've heard good arguments for the EV investments, but also there's certain opportunity costs because they're very large investments. Kind of shifting gears a little bit, Stuart, to what extent do you think that there is a culture of entrepreneurship that currently exists in Canada?
yeah, I think it's again, it goes back to my original statement about risk. I think Risk is now being built into our financial models differently than it was in the past. I think we have the opportunity to have a startup community that's probably you talk about Toronto as a good example, Vancouver, where I am, almost second to none. There's just a lot of really good ideas and companies that are coming out of it. The challenge will always be scaling these companies. I think that I'm involved with digital, the global innovation cluster here in Vancouver, and I've seen some really incredible young Canadian companies. And the challenge for them is you got great technology, you have really good people. The government's approach to bringing skilled labor into the country is great. It allows us to kind of grow at that front end. The challenge will always be, having the management skill sets in the country that will allow the company to scale. Okay, and that is one thing that I was really impressed by when I was in the Valley in particular. That ecosystem is such that it's not just about the technologies and the people who can develop the technologies. It's really about the people who can sell it. Okay, and to sell the company and to sell the products that the companies have, and they can scale so quickly. And that's the issue that you have with today is that technologies move so quickly. You have to be able to scale rapidly to capture the opportunity, and that's I think our biggest single challenge. And there's ironically, certainly when I was in the Valley, when I was consul general in 2009, and we were building the C100, you take a look at the number of Canadians that are in C-suite executives in Valley companies, those that are serial entrepreneurs based in the Valley. If we could just capture some of those and bring them back to Canada, and many do want to be as helpful as they possibly can, but there's no necessarily real desire to move back to make it happen. But there's such a great um, group of people that are really skilled at kind of taking companies from the beginnings to the next level and then grow them to multi-billion-dollar companies. And that's the challenge that we have. And I don't know if there's an easy solution to it, quite frankly. We're just we're too big a country and too small a population, to kind of get the scale. And that's why I say going global is so important to us. It means maybe going to the United States, but there's always a risk to do that because you'll end up losing you may lose your technology in your company, or you go offshore to Europe and Asia and take a look at your opportunities there.
Your friends Mark Wiseman and Dominic Barden were involved in setting up an organization called the Century Initiative that advocates for 100 million Canadians. Do you think that a key part of making Canada more globally competitive is rapidly increasing our population so that we have like 100 million Canadians?
Well, I mean, we've already seen the challenges of doing that. I personally think yes, it's important to do that, and if we can bring in the right type of people who are the contributing, and I think our skilled worker program is really a good example of that. Yeah, it's like everything else. When you create a policy, you don't always know what the impacts will be. Okay, and so you bring in these people, and then all of a sudden you have a housing crisis, or at least you think you have a housing crisis. And I live in Vancouver, and it's very evident here. I mean, there's no question, and I'm sure it's the same is true in Toronto. Scott, you probably know that as better than I do. But yeah, so it's really hard to anticipate what will always be the impact of the policy that you bring in. But fundamentally, we have an aging population, and so by having a immigration policy which will allow us to bring the right type of people into the country to help build the economy is a really good thing. And whether it's 100 million people or whether it's 50 million people in the next 10 years, that's going to make a difference in terms of how we are going to be able to keep the type of lifestyle and the policies that we have in place, whether it's around education and healthcare. It's really quite critical for us to be able to grow the population sensibly.
Shifting a little bit back to that culture of entrepreneurship piece, earlier this year I wrote an op-ed that was Canada, like that basically was the case for why Canada lacks an entrepreneurial culture. And it was interesting, after I wrote that piece, I've had more people reach out to me than anything I've ever written, and including probably a dozen different Canadians who now live in the US who are like, you nailed it on the head. They're like, the reason I can't come back to Canada is because the culture isn't entrepreneurial enough. It's a place where people like to say no all the time. and people can be closed-minded to new ideas. Now, in some ways, these people have self-selected out and
Yeah,
aren't
and yeah,
necessarily representative of Canadian society. And I'm not sure I agree with them. But do you think that there is something that uh, do you think that we are getting to become more entrepreneurial, like as a culture, as a country, or do you think that we're regressing?
no, I think we are. I mean, quite frankly, and it goes back to my other comment about when you bring all these people in, where are the immigrants coming from? Okay, quite frankly, where are the skilled immigrants coming from? And they're coming from places like Ukraine, India, uh, Iran. They're coming into this country, and they're entrepreneurial just by coming here, and they're coming to come to a culture which they will be able to live and grow their family, and create economic development for themselves, or economic prosperity for themselves and the people in their family. So I think, if you take a look at how our country is changing just demographically. I mean, I was on the seawall on the weekend for sunset to watch the sun go down. Everybody walking by. I mean, it was all different languages. I heard Spanish, I heard Farsi, I heard Chinese, I heard Hindi and Punjabi. I mean, there were very few. I mean, hardly any people who were speaking English. Now, that's a good thing in my mind, and it just tells me that the face of our country is changing, and I think in many ways that's making us more entrepreneurial, just by the reality of what's happening from our immigration patterns. And you take a look at the number of foreign students that we have in our country. You're very familiar with this, Scott, and what that means as well. Those who have a work permit and the ability to stay will be contributors to our society. So again, that whole entrepreneurial dimension of who we are and what we are has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. And it's going to change even more dramatically as things continue. And it's, I think, only for our benefit, quite frankly, as long as, and this goes into another issue that we're seeing right now. It's, you come to the country, it's about integration into the country. It's not about bringing baggage from your old country with you. And that's a challenge that we're now facing in many ways. And it's a different issue, but it's not one we necessarily need to talk about. But it's something we have to face going forward. There's the pluses, like everything else, and then you always have to deal with some of the other issues that come with that.
We've talked about some of the different ways to foster more entrepreneurial culture, increased immigration, some of the industrial policy interventions and learnings from Taiwan, Silicon Valley. What are other ways that you think that the government or the Canadians individually can foster a more entrepreneurial culture?
Well, I mean, this sounds a bit trite, but it's very true. It's about the acceptance of failure. And to be a successful entrepreneur, no one's going to succeed right out of the box. It's just a reality, particularly if you're young. I mean, you have these ideas, you have usually a really good idea, but you run up against a resistance, or there's some problems, or typically the market's working against you, and you fail. Okay, historically, and certainly during when I was growing up and going to university and looking at doing things after university, failure wasn't acceptable. It was kind of a black mark on your record. That's changed so much, Scott. And again, over the years that I've been watching this, that although the banks are still in many ways asset-based lenders, aren't willing to take the risk, there's a different attitude towards it. And there's more venture money out there, more people understanding that to be successful, you do need to fail. You need to test the market. You need to do things in a way that's going to ensure that you're going to be able to succeed. That, I think, is really a critical element. And the more we accept the notion of failure, and that it's not the end of the person's reputational history because they failed, and in fact, it's a good thing. That's important, I mean, to go forward. And certainly, if you take a look at my exposure in the valley over the original 6 years I was there, and then the year when I was consul general, the number of you talk to people who are quite successful. The number of times they failed before they got to be successful is really quite remarkable, and it's acceptable. It's accepted down there, right? So
Yeah, it's just a part of a life, and the
yeah,
recognizing that everybody feels. Even you look at like Steve Jobs and his trajectory, created a company that's now worth $4 trillion. most valuable company in the world. But he was fired by the board and was in exile for what, 15 years, right? Like he had
Yeah.
some dark times in his life and career. And you look at most entrepreneurial people, particularly folks, often it seems like the people who have the most extreme success can also have the most extreme troughs in their careers as well. What this is a somewhat of a more focused question from the broader subject that we've talked about, but how do you think that the school system, in particular the K to 12 school system, can be adjusted to further imbue a sense of entrepreneurial culture in young Canadians?
Well, that's, I mean, that's, you know, I'm not an education expert. But what I can say is um, it's important that people growing up through the educational system recognize those who have been successful entrepreneurs, and to be able to define why they were successful entrepreneurs and why it was for them such a fulfilling way of living. Um, and I can't say, quite frankly, when I was going through school, even when I was at university, getting a lot of exposure to people who were successful entrepreneurs, and so it was really not something that was part of the psyche. I taught for a couple of years at Queens after I graduated with my MBA, and I was always amazed. I was talking to the kids in sort of in the graduating class, because you'd have an opportunity to talk to them, and well, what are you going to go do? Of course, this is now we're talking early to mid '80s, and I'm going to become an accountant. Well, why do you want to become an accountant? Well, because I know I'm going to get a job. And so, well, did you ever think about going into marketing? No. Why would I go into marketing? So literally, the undergraduate commerce class at that point in time, 80% of the students were went into accounting, which is a great occupation. Don't get me wrong. And only 20% were going into marketing and other areas. And so, I think in the K through 12 system, putting modules um, into um, into entrepreneurship and having ways of being able to recognize their success, I think is so important. So I think we're one of the things that we did at the foundation, because we were so concerned about Asia competence and the lack of Asia competence from a Canadian perspective, was we worked with the BC Ministry of Education to put in modules in the case. Well, basically, we started off at the high school system, put in modules on Asia competence, so that it wasn't a course on Asia competence, but there were modules that the Teachers Federation and the teachers at the various schools could take and put into their various classes to talk about Asia and why Asia was important for us and for Canada. And again, it's a start, right? I mean, that's where you have to go. So it's the same thing. Building modules on entrepreneurship, you can stick it into a math course, into an economics course. You can stick it into social studies. I mean, there are different places that you can have it, and those, building modules. And maybe this is something VFC should be doing, as part of what your plan for the future is. Maybe work with people that have done this before and say, what kind of modules can we stick into the K through 12 system that would really encourage people to become entrepreneurs? I mean, not everybody wants to be an entrepreneur, quite frankly, so but at least give them the opportunity to know and understand what it's like to do it, right? So,
but everyone can be entrepreneurial.
Everyone can be entrepreneurial. That's right.
Yeah. And I do think it is interesting to think about, and some good food for thought for VFC. There's an interesting organization in the UK that I recently learned about, actually founded by a BCer who moved to England, Dame Sherry Coutu. And she was like one of the foremost kind of innovation experts for the UK government. She wrote this report called the Scale Up Report that was published back in 2015 that influenced a lot of British kind of high tech entrepreneurship policy. But she founded this organization that it brings entrepreneurs into schools just to speak. And they've had, I think, spoken to like 100,000 K to 12 students, like had a ton of success. My number's probably off on that. But anyway, just to say that it's interesting that extent to just like motivate people to sort of see entrepreneurs directly in the school system. But even thinking at like even ages 6, 7, 8, right? Like, how can you get young people doing little projects or being involved in identifying and acting upon opportunities, and how can that contribute to a more entrepreneurial country is I think a really interesting idea out of the kind of scope of VFC currently. But to your point, Stuart, I agree. I think a good long-term idea. Stuart,
Well, when you think about it, how many of us set up lemon stands when we were kids? You know, I didn't do it, but I know a lot of my friends were doing paper, newspaper routes. I mean, that was sort of your first introduction to becoming an entrepreneur when you were a kid, right? It's riding around your bicycle and delivering newspapers. Not like people don't do that today, but there are there are other things that again were kind of got us into it at a young age that you don't necessarily see today. So I'm a big fan of being able to take what you can and put it on a device. So whether it's your iPhone or Android device or whatever the case may be, and have a module that's attached to something that you're doing in school to say, hey, look, think about this. So in other ways, connect technology with the action and use what people are using on a daily, like almost on a minute by minute basis these days. So it's just be this. It gets all about creativity, and that creativity is the fundamental part of entrepreneurship, right? So.
One of my first entrepreneurial experiences was in grade 8 at the Halifax Grammar School. The building I went in was like a late post-Victorian era, like 1910 school house that I went to school in. And there was a little kind of, it was called the Candy Cave. It was in the basement of the building. And it was a little place where you could sell candy out of a window. So I would sell candy out of this window to all of these kids until I got shut down by the school. They're like, you can't operate this candy business.
Well, I hate to say that, but that's a good example of some of the regulatory problems we have in our country, right? It's a good that kind of, I won't say crushes entrepreneurship, but it you kind of go, oh my gosh, why do I can't do that? Okay, so
I'd buy I was a candy arbitrager. I would buy the candy from Costco, then upsell it by a double. And it was the middle school I went in, oddly starting grade 5, because it was an independent school. The kind of years were a little bit different. So it would be great, like very young. It was some very keen candy buyers. I had cornered the marketplace, but yeah, it was I agree. A good example of regulatory capture potentially. Stewart, this has been such a fun conversation. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast. This felt felt like just one of our normal chats over the years. So thanks for coming on.
No, I appreciate it, Scott. And it's always a pleasure chatting with you. And I think you're a really good example of an entrepreneur and taking something that you've done with VFC, basically starting from nothing into what it is today. So congratulations on that. And it still is a pleasure working with you and having a chance to chat.
Yeah, and thank you for all of your support in building VFC. VFC would be a very different organization if it wasn't for all of your support. And you made a huge impact, including a lot on the work we do on international students, but also in a few other domains. So thanks for everything you've done, and looking forward to our future chats.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks for listening to this episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and through our email list. And be sure to subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss our next episode. Have feedback on today's episode? Let us know directly in the app. Thanks again for listening and for joining the new wave of entrepreneurs. Till next time.